Well, thank you very much, Pastor Odin, for your gracious invitation. And uh, I want to also give a special shout out to Ted Schrader, who's uh, what we call in our Jewish tradition a mensch, which is the best thing you can say about a person, an overall fine human being. Ted is a member of our multi-faith coalition for restorative justice, and he's the co-chair of the advocacy committee, and he's done some really outstanding work for legislative issues related to incarceration reform. And I really appreciate him as a person and the work that he does, and appreciate the invitation to speak with you today. I also I love Psalm 104. I appreciate your bringing that one. That's one of my favorite psalms, and it has a very prominent place in Jewish liturgy, and maybe that's a subject for a future day.
Hmm.
Uh, Thank you, Pastor Odin, for your kind invitation. Normally, when I say the kinds of things I'm going to say today, I would love to have a response from the congregation. I know that's not practical today for various reasons, but if anybody wants to continue the conversation in any way, you can get my email address from Pastor Odin or from Ted. Today's subject, as the pastor mentioned, is the famous verse from Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. In Hebrew, it's v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. A lot can be said about this verse. I'm going to take a somewhat unconventional approach and share a perspective that you may not have heard. And I appreciate Pastor Odin's introducing you a little bit to this idea. Uh, and in applying this interpretation, I may be a little bit controversial, and I hope that's okay. I'm going to start with the interpretation of a medieval rabbi known as the Rashbam. That's an acronym for Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir. He lived in the 12th century. He died in 1158, so about 850 years ago. And I'm going to, and he basically said what Pastor Odin said, that loving your neighbor includes wishing our neighbor the same well-being that we want for ourselves. I'm going to read you a few words of what he said specifically, and it'll sound familiar because Pastor Odin did a great job of encapsulating it. He says as follows: sometimes a person will be interested in his neighbor's welfare in certain respects only. He may wish him wealth, but not scholarly attainments and the like. But even if he wishes him well in everything, in wealth, honor, learning, and wisdom, he will still not want him to be absolutely equal with him. He will still want to be superior to him in some respect. It was this form of selfishness that the Torah condemned. Um, Now, what the Rashbam says is interesting. And I'm sure if we're honest with ourselves, we'll see that we all do this sometimes. We can all come up with personal examples of where we've done this in our lives. We're not proud of it, but we're human. But maybe more importantly, this is not only true in our personal lives. Uh, I appreciate Pastor Odin applying this to the kids. He did a great job. But it's also true on a bigger scale. We are sympathetic with people when they are down. We don't want them to be hurt, but that doesn't mean we want them to be equal or even at times to surpass us. So perhaps the greatest American to ever live was Abraham Lincoln. He freed the slaves. What he did was magnificent. It was courageous. It changed America for all time. But Abraham Lincoln did not believe that blacks and whites were equal. He did not believe in racial equality. It was one thing for white people at the time not to enslave black people, but that's not the same as full racial equality. That was something that few white Americans could conceive of in those days. But a full love, as understood by Rashbam, would have meant that white America would have, at the very least, given freed black slaves the 40 acres and a mule that they were promised but never received, and then gone about creating a society in which Black men and women could truly flourish as true equals. Now I'm going to give you what may be a slightly more controversial example. There is a book by an American Jewish novelist named Dara Horn called People Love Dead Jews. She meant to shock people with that title. In a moment, I'm going to talk about how what Dara Horn says about the Jewish people applies, I believe, to all people. But first, the Jewish people. People sympathized with the Jewish people when we were obviously needy. 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust, and the world was appropriately shocked and horrified. And as Holocaust victims, we got a lot of sympathy. In fact, shortly after the Holocaust, in 1965, the Catholic Church officially declared that Jews were not responsible for the death of Jesus as a collective, and maybe even more importantly, that anti-Semitism is a grave sin. It's not okay to hurt Jews. This was really remarkable for the Catholic Church to basically reverse 1,700 years of doctrine. And I still, when I speak about this to my own people, I say, this is one of the greatest examples of history of what we call teshuvah or repentance. And we should all emulate that moment as a beautiful example. It was revolutionary for the church to do what it did. And it's not a coincidence that it happened only 4 years after the 1961 Eichmann trial, in which the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed to the entire world. On the other hand, it took the Vatican until 1993 to officially recognize the State of Israel, which was formed in 1948, because the world loves a victim. We are naturally sympathetic to people who are obviously in pain or in danger. We are naturally sympathetic to the underdog. But when that same person or people recovers and proves capable of standing on their own 2 feet and even flourishes and succeeds, that person or that people too often loses our sympathy. In 1948, Israel had the world's sympathy because it was a fledgling state trying to get on its feet only 3 years after the Holocaust. But beginning in 1967, when Israel became powerful, that sympathy began to disappear. Now, the relationship between Israel and the Jewish people and the Arab world and the Muslim world is highly complex, and now is not the moment to delve into that complexity. But I do want to touch on one dimension of this relationship today. For some 1,500 years, there were many times that periods of intense persecution were followed by long periods when Jews lived under Christian rule or Muslim rule, and they were tolerated, protected, and offered a helping hand. But for all of that time, even in the best of times, there was no precedent for Jews to be the equals of Christians or Muslims until 1948. True love goes beyond sympathy and even tolerance. True love means accepting our friends' equality, their strength, their success, and rejoicing in it. So I hope you'll understand when I say this, and I say this in all humility. It was disappointing, but not surprising to the Jewish community that on October 7th, we received much sympathy from all over the world. Because once again, for a brief moment in time, we were the victim. So we were loved. We were loved again. But on October 8th, the minute we proved ourselves capable of fighting back, the minute we refused to remain victims, that love, in many cases, too many cases, disappeared. Now, there was a time I thought that this was a pattern that applied uniquely to the Jewish people, but the more I think about it, the more I see it as universal, as happening to all kinds of people. So, for example, it was easy for America to extend its hand to the Black community as long as blacks were perceived as persecuted and a powerless minority. I'm a child of the 60s, so I remember who could help but be sympathetic when hoses were turned on children in the segregated South? And who is more powerless than a child? But it's one thing to say hurting our neighbor is wrong. It's another to accept our neighbor as a true equal. It's one thing to love a child. It's another thing to love an adult. For centuries in America, even when blacks were treated kindly, they were seen as children in need of adult support. But when the black community flourished and created a Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when they showed themselves capable of being adults, that was too much for the white community, and they burned Tulsa to the ground. And when did racism rear its ugly head most acutely in America in our day? After the election of Barack Obama to the presidency, because it's one measure of love to love your neighbor when your neighbor is hurting, and you can offer him or her a helping hand. But it's another level entirely to love your neighbor when she succeeds and is your equal and has power and has true agency and maybe even more successful than we are. And the same is true for the Asian American community. It's one thing to shake our heads in shame and to say how awful it was that Japanese Americans were put in internment camps during World War II. That's sympathy for people that we saw as victims. But when Asian Americans made up more than 20% of Harvard, Harvard thought that was just a little too much and tried to restrict the number of Asian Americans from attending. And if there's a resurgence of anti-Asian sentiment in our country, it's precisely because that community has known so much success. By succeeding too much, by no longer being the victim, they have forfeited our love. And now, most sensitive of all, I believe we can also apply this psychology to the Palestinians. No one paid much attention to the Palestinians until they began dying by the tens of thousands. What kind of message are we sending? We will love you, but only if you are suffering deeply, only as victims. What incentive are we giving to the Palestinian people to build something, hospitals, schools, businesses, rather than tunnels to turn them into victims? Of course, we should always reach out to those who are in need. The Bible says to the Jewish people, and this line is sacred to Christians as well, you shall love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. We should never stop sympathizing with people in great need. But love your neighbor as yourself asks of us something more, something harder. And that is to love our neighbor enough to want them to be as successful as we are, to not be threatened by their success or their capability. Because if we cannot achieve that level, what are we really saying to our neighbor with our sympathy? We are saying, you will have our love only when you are beneath us, only when you need us. We want you to be in a state of perpetual dependence on us. Otherwise, we will not love you anymore. And in fact, we may even hate you. Surely, this is not true love. Sometimes groups that have known persecution get involved in a kind of victim Olympics. We compete for who has suffered the most. My suffering is greater than yours, because we fear that the only way we can keep the world's attention and love is to appear as a victim. This is not a recipe for world repair. In America and all over the world, it would be very worth our while to aspire to a new level of love, a love that doesn't require our neighbor to perpetually need our help, a love that isn't limited to reaching out to her in her hour of pain, a love that isn't conditioned on our friend remaining an eternal victim or an eternal child, but instead celebrates our friends' successes and joys with a full heart. Thank you.